Greetings, friends. I want to talk about how the word capitalism has become clumsy, increasingly meaningless, and perhaps it's decomposing as a concept. You could say the same thing about communism, too. I think part of the matter really is just about individualism versus collectivism. This idea in the West that if you are collectivizing, then you are a communist, and that we should all be good individualists striving for material gain on our own as individuals, and that's capitalism. But what is capitalism really? If I look at the dictionary online definition, it says an economic system in which investment in and ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange of wealth is made up and maintained chiefly by private individuals or corporations, especially as contrasted to cooperatively or state-owned means of wealth. End quote. But that's already ambiguous because, well, okay, private individuals, okay, I understand, but then corporations, that could be owned by an individual. A corporation could be owned by multiple individuals. There could be multiple shareholders. There might be one CEO, but the CEO doesn't have all the power. Maybe he does. I guess you could say that in corporations that, yeah, they do tend to be essentially ruled executively. So there usually is one or just a few powerful people in control at the top of these big capitalist corporations. So this definition is somewhat helpful in that it points to the private enterprise being a key distinction in capitalism versus cooperative or government control of business. But this definition also produces more confusion because terms like the means of production, we mean farming today, or what do we mean Bitcoin mining, or what do we mean by that today? Distribution of goods and services will be undertaken by individuals, but of course individuals belong to companies a lot of the time, which are collections of individuals. So there's obviously lots of collectivities in capitalism, which are businesses, smaller and larger. So this is not very helpful to really understand what do we mean by capitalism. I mean, of course, I'm not going to go back to Marx. I don't have the time to read that stuff. But just commonly today, what might people mean by capitalism? We might think of making money, doing business, growing the economy, developing industry, these sorts of things. Growth, development, line go up, be happy, live the life. And then people say there was capitalism in the past, but I mean, that was farmers, laborers, craftsmen, warriors. I wouldn't call that capitalism. That's just not. Like, you can't say a medieval peasant in England or whatever country, or any peasant before the industrial revolution was a type of capitalist. You just cannot say that. I mean, maybe you can start to move in that direction with enclosure in England, and you get like independent sharecroppers and that sort of mentality around the time that Adam Smith was writing Wealth of Nations. Yes, this is when this idea is born. But even then, and even up till now, you can't really think of farmers as capitalists. It was always a bourgeois thing. It was the merchants. Now you may be saying, what do you mean? How is a farmer not a capitalist? Of course, farmers can be capitalists, and today we see big business indeed getting into farming. But has that been a good thing? I would argue it's been a disaster. I would argue that farming becoming capitalism removes humans from their rooted place in the land because it becomes increasingly dominated by a small number of people. You don't get the family homestead anymore. You get these huge companies growing soybeans in other parts of the world. It's not a good thing that farming has become all about making money. And number two, that's not how farming was for most of our history. And this gets into another understanding of capitalism, which I would say is using money to make more money. With money changers, usurers, owning stocks, speculating in real estate, or perhaps just trading in commodities, trading different commodities, acquiring gold and silver. I don't have any problem about doing many of these things, although we were instructed, I believe, not to engage in usury. That's my understanding as a Christian. We weren't supposed to do that. But of course, it does happen. But my point is that this other understanding of capitalism might be the immaterial wealth, perhaps the artificial wealth, the engaging in wealth for wealth's sake, using currency to acquire more currency. There's always something artificial about that. You're acquiring things that have limited practical value, but high monetary value, high exchange value. So there is some practical value to gold and silver, but most of their value is simply that they function well symbolically and they function efficiently in a monetary system. They always have, because they are indestructible. So that's not the same thing as being a farmer, being a craftsperson. It's just not. But we don't really have these distinctions today in how capitalism is understood. It's just all thrown in there. Relevant to this subject, I'm going to discuss a thread on X that I was following recently. I don't have the screenshots because when I try to upload them to my Gmail account from my Android phone, for some reason they don't appear in my email account for like a week after I send the email, or sometimes they appear right away. Usually they don't, so it's just totally unreliable. So I'm just going to read this. But Joel Berry, who is a centrist, he says that if you believe in individualism, meritocracy, and capitalism, you shouldn't import people who hate individualism, meritocracy, and capitalism. And then Dave Green, the distributist, says, it's funny how that works, isn't it? It's almost like liberal capitalism, without high religiosity and ethnic cohesion, naturally educates or imports a population hostile to liberalism, thus making modern secular liberal societies naturally self-terminating by their own logic. Like liberalism becomes illiberal. Someone may have pointed this out before. I hope they weren't woke right, as it's called. He's mocking that term, woke right. It is a term that deserves to be mocked. So then, commenting on Dave's response, we get this guy, Kofi Anon, coming in, defending capitalism. And he says, capitalists are not driving the importation of a zillion Bomalians living on welfare. Some small-time people benefit, a guy with a chicken plant, the mayor of Springfield who owns some housing that Haitians get put in, but those guys are not the ones running U.S. aid or chartering jets for those people. He means chartering jets for the migrants. He says there's a massive network running it, meaning running mass migration into America. And this network is not made up of capitalists, although he admits that capitalists are driving the H-1Bs, those work visas. So he admits somewhat, but he's basically defending capitalism, and maybe he has a point. So actually, the Black Horse, who's a Canadian guy, he says, yes, in this respect, U.S. immigration is kind of a unique case in the West. Canada, in contrast to America, imported an underclass almost explicitly to staff the service and care worker industries at, quote, acceptable costs so that boomer lifestyle expectations could be met. He's acknowledging that maybe the situation in the U.S. was a bit different. It's not just pure capitalists bringing in the migrants into the U.S., but in the West as a whole, in Canada, the argument still holds. It's the big business that brought in most of the migrants. So we get some interesting comments on this. This guy, Jan, saying, both of these things can be true. Our enemy is the bohemian bourgeois. They are both culturally left or liberal and economically capitalist. I don't know if he means that there are two groups. One group, they're in the same class, but one is capitalist and one is culturally left. That's probably true to an extent, but they are functionally of the bourgeois group. He says that mass migration satisfies both of these inclinations. And then we get Kofi Anon responding. He says, well, everyone is economically capitalist. Capitalism is just a reality. And someone asks him, why did capitalism take so long to exist? That's a good question. He responds that capitalism is exchange and property. It has existed basically since herding and agriculture. So what do you know? Hey guys, basically once we were coming out of the Ice Age and we found some yaks and we started herding the yaks and selling their wool, well, that's already capitalism. And many people will argue this. At that level, it's just so vague. It's so vague because those same peoples could be collectivizing. They could be doing all sorts of things that the modern mind would regard as that's communism, that's pagan, that's totally against Enlightenment values. Oh, but they're selling their wool. So they're capitalists, right? It's just so stupid. It's so vague. That's so useless a definition. Exchange and property, I mean, come on. I mean, even in Maoist China, some exchange going on. Maybe not private property, of course. It's good to have private property, but that doesn't mean that it's essentially true, apart from culture. It's just floating in a cultural matrix. Not that I have any real problem with capitalism. I've engaged in capitalism myself, meaning trying to make money. Right, trying to start a business, doing these sorts of things. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not defending the capital C capitalism as this way to improve society through individual enterprise alone. And we'll get into more of the question why that's a problem. When you put a price tag on anything and everything, that's when the society starts to erode. So lastly, there was this other guy was following Kirk Lubomov, and he posted an example from a residential property, I believe in the Calgary area. Nice residential area where the house had a decent value, a nice backyard, but then there was a house next door which was torn down, and because the developer was allowed to by the city council, maybe they had lobbied the city council, but the regulations allowed for a type of structure to be erected which was described as a home for transients, or at least that's what the person who was criticizing it called it. This big ugly thing that blocked out sunlight, and really not the sort of thing you'd want to see next to your nice house, and it lowered the value of the house. The person who's viewing this thing, it lowered the value of their house now, which is funny if they're bringing that up, because if you're overly concerned with house value, then aren't you very much invested in capitalism yourself, if you're really concerned about your house value? In today's context, there's so much speculation and so much wealth tied up in housing and the transfer of real estate. What he was getting at is, how is this allowed that you can just change a residential neighborhood and bring in something which is negative for the entire neighborhood, that most of the residents there would not like to see. But because of private enterprise, and because this is an enterprise that could bring in more money, and that money gets taxed by the government, so under capitalism it should be allowed, right? So you had someone questioning the person who made the post saying, are you a communist? Meaning, are you a communist for questioning that this transient dwelling was erected next to a nice residential house? Because you don't want to be communist, right? So this again is the stupid dichotomy where if you believe that residents can unite collectively to change the laws to prevent this sort of thing from happening, that you're a communist. But meanwhile, the company or the developer, they have money already. It takes money to make more money, right? Where could that be more true than in capitalism? And they use the money and their influence over the city council to get these zoning laws changed. So they're using power, acting on their own interest. Oh, but they're acting more individually. It's only one of them or a few of them. But, a residents in a neighborhood uniting? Communism. That's communism. I'm not defending communism here, but this stupid false dichotomy between capitalism and communism, I've been focusing on capitalism in this video. But because communism has already been discussed, everyone's already shown how stupid that is. That's why I'm focusing more on capitalism here too. But both of those are ideologies that seem to be, or have already long ago decomposed. They're increasingly meaningless today. Not that there are real communists, of course, or communist political party, but they're just not really people that you can take seriously. I don't believe China today is Maoist China. It's not the same thing. Russia today is not the Soviet Union. In that form of communism, we've moved past that in history. That's not to say we can't fall into totalitarianism. What happened during COVID? That was a form of what was no longer liberal. It became illiberal, but it was the lefties now become illiberal, become really the left, not so much liberal anymore, into a fascist psycho-tyranny facilitated by big business, working with government. So I don't know what you even call that anymore. That's communist, that's capitalist. It's increasingly irrelevant terms. And I don't have any problem with centralization of power or authority, authoritarianism either, because to some extent that's inevitable anyways. Only a few individuals have control over the money supply, really affect things in your life like inflation, these sorts of things. You don't have a vote over that. Hasta luego, amigos.